"I don't know what the world's coming to," my mother said one morning in 1980. I was 8, and I certainly didn't know. I was already depressed enough by nuclear war. Arms talks with the Soviets were in the news every day, and my teacher had recently read us a story about a family in small-town America being vaporized in a blinding flash, leaving behind only a trace of soot. On top of that, my mother couldn't stop talking about the Antichrist. There was a veritable Antichrist mania at the end of the 70s, with the stolid Brezhnev somehow one of the top suspects. And she had a remarkable talent for describing the end times in the most terrifying detail. Basically, my childhood was like a living chick tract. My father had retired on a chief petty officer's pension when he was 37, and this was our sole income at a time when inflation was 10% and magazines had headline articles like "How to Make a One-Dish Meal Last All Week." We were prime audience for advice like that. There was always food, but only thanks to the most careful planning and conservation by my parents. That morning I rummaged for a desperate breakfast. No pleasant distinctions between breakfast, lunch, and dinner foods. Yesterday it had been grits and leftover tuna casserole and lima beans. For the second time in as many meals, I didn't touch the lima beans. I wasn't that hungry. My mother said something about the Ethiopian famine. It was novel at the time and the culinary bane of a whole generation of American children. But not even the Antichrist could make me eat those beans. Well, today I found some bread and made toast. There was no butter, no jelly, but the peanut butter jar had some residue clinging to the sides. I scraped it again with a butter knife, round and round inside the jar. I got enough to spread a thin film over the toast. I put the lid back on and tossed the jar in the trash. 5 minutes later, my mother stepped between me and Looney Tunes, shaking the jar and talking about the Ethiopians. She scraped the jar again and tossed it away again. Soon my father was lecturing her on the virtues of jar scraping. Now, my father was a champion jar scraper. I think he earned a medal for it in the Navy. And by the time he gave up and declared the jar empty, I couldn't see a trace of peanut butter inside. It was time to go to the grocery store, no matter how broke we might be. My parents set out to gather all their resources. First, spare change. In pockets, my mother's overstuffed purse, under chair cushions, sofa cushions, swept into corners, rolled under tables. There were some pennies in a tin, and my college fund in a jar. It never got beyond $1 or $2 before being raided for grocery money. Then my father took cartons of soda bottles out to the car. The heavy glass bottles were worth a dime each for their deposit. They would be sent back to the bottling plant, washed and refilled. The money would go toward more bottled sodas, in a kind of soda pyramid scheme that would end only when there weren't enough bottles to pay for another carton of soda. Then the accumulation of bottles would begin again. Meanwhile, my mother sorted coupons in a portable file that resembled an accordion. We seldom bought anything not discounted by either a sale or a coupon, preferably both. My mother took great pride in her couponing prowess, and the amount she saved the family by clipping and sorting and filing and clerk debating was always one of the first weapons drawn during frequent parental melees. My father, as a coupon skeptic, had in turn mastered all the arguments of coupon unbelievers from the Greeks and Romans on, and used them in and out of context, whatever it took to win. I had outfitted my closet quite comfortably and spent much of my time there in peace. The family Pinto rode on retreads, which were rapidly on their way to becoming detreads. We drove to Winn-Dixie, the only grocery on our side of town, and the only one that allowed customers to go barefoot. We weren't barefoot, but I think we all felt a certain social boost from seeing others walking around in bare, dirty feet. This may be why my mother didn't insist on driving across town to Albertsons, where coupons were doubled. Shoes were about the only sign of wealth we could manage at the store. We went through the aisles, picking the cheapest goods in amounts sufficient for the next few days. When my father's check came in, we would be back to splurge on luxuries, like a big box of powdered milk and a 5-pound tube of special bargain hamburger. My mother kept stopping to search her file for coupons. My father rolled his eyes. I stared at foods I'd never eaten, not that I necessarily wanted to, like asparagus in silver-papered cans, and sardines in little flat tins bearing King Oscar's portrait. Until recently, I had wondered whether he personally caught the sardines. The cart was still almost empty when we finished, the cluster of staples huddled together in the center of the basket. Only bread remained to be added. We didn't go to the bread aisle, but to the front, where bins were piled with discounted foods. In one, bread was stacked, assorted loaves thrown together by a common fault. They were all near or past their sell-by date. A sign billed them as day-old rather than expired or stale. This didn't bother us. What mattered to us was the price. Bread was normally about $1, but these day-old loaves cost only a quarter. My parents rooted through the bin for whole wheat, checking the dates and tossing bread in the cart. My mother had the last word on bread. She would put the day-old loaves in the freezer and thaw them as needed, almost good as new, and threw back several loaves my father had selected. He glared at her, but she was busy sizing up bread for dents. I just stood by, trying to look like I had nothing to do with this, showing the first symptoms of snobbery as I tucked in my cast-off polo shirt, suddenly aware that everyone in the store had their shirt tails hanging out. On the way home, my mother gave a triumphant review of her savings. She went down the receipt, noting the amount she had saved, and how my father would have paid the full amount because of his disdain for coupons and for studying the weekly Winn-Dixie flyer. My father expressed the heartfelt wish to be back on a battleship, and how much he had always envied the sailors who had no families to return to. My mother grimaced but kept reading. "I saved 74 cents on every loaf of bread times 5, she said. "That's almost $4. I know you don't appreciate it." Sitting in the back of the Pinto, I wondered what the world was coming to, and whether it would be so bad to be reduced to a trace of soot.